The Emperor of Russia learned that I was in Paris and asked Monsieur Chernychev to inquire if I would receive him. When he called, he said, "I'm just back from Compiègne. What I see there discourages me. I love France. I wish her to be prosperous, and I fear this Bourbon family will not know how to ensure her happiness." The king showed me his proclamation. It was dated the 19th year of his reign. I advised him to remove this date, but he did not seem inclined to do so. I foresee that he will alienate many of his supporters, and his is not the kind of regime France needs. I am sorry because I feel I am to blame, but I did propose to Monsieur de Talleyrand to call the deputies together to draw up a constitution and fix definite terms on which the Bourbons should be allowed to enter Paris. But in the first moments of enthusiasm, it did not seem as though the Comte d'Artois could get here quickly enough to satisfy the people. At any rate, it is not my fault if they have made a mistake. I listened to him without seeking to discuss a subject regarding which I might have said too much. I merely asked him about the Duchesse d'Angoulême. "She may have qualities," he answered, "but if you saw her, you would change your opinion of her. Even her voice is harsh, and she has nothing of a woman's gentleness about her." He afterwards spoke about the Emperor Napoleon, told me how he had loved him, and how deeply he had been hurt to discover that he had formed a mistaken estimate of his character. He also said how doubly indignant he had been with the Emperor Napoleon for having provoked this war, since it estranged him from the man he had made a friend of at Tilsit and at Erfurt. Finally, he concluded that although admitting the emperor's genius, he had sworn never to accept a reconciliation with him. Everything he said was uttered in such a frank and sincere way that I could not help forming a favorable opinion of his character. Moreover, he was the only man, Frenchman or foreigner, who spoke in a proper manner about the Emperor Napoleon. I believe I should have been indignant with anyone who might have pointed out to me that this man was an enemy of the family to which I belonged. About this time, my brother came to Paris, having surrendered on honorable terms to the Austrians. He was full of confidence in the future on account of the stipulations concerning him contained in the Treaty of April 11th. He had taken his family to Munich to stay with the King of Bavaria, his father-in-law. The purpose of his visit to Paris was to thank the Allied sovereigns and learn exactly what his fate was to be. He was well received everywhere, especially by the Emperor Alexander, who was anxious to make his acquaintance. The only time he called at the court of the Bourbons, the king, Louis XVIII, spoke of the good my mother had done for France. The Duc d'Orléans mentioned his former friendship with my father. The Duc d'Angoulême paid little attention to my brother, and the Duc de Berry informed him that the French troops were very fine-looking and asked if he had ever seen any of them. But on the whole, Eugène could not complain of the way he was received. My brother had not been in Paris long before he became conscious that the execution of the treaty, as far as he was concerned, was most difficult. No one knew where he was to go. Everyone held views about what ought to be given him. My mother's sole wish was that her son should receive a position worthy of him, but the only person who supported her claims was the Emperor of Russia. As regards the latter, we found ourselves in a most extraordinary position. The friendship he displayed towards us and that which we felt for him precluded any idea of either of us acting from selfish motives. Nevertheless, he seemed embarrassed to find himself acting as our protector, when it was he who had brought about the entire change in our fortunes. He did not know how to make himself useful to us without risking hurting our pride. We who appreciated all his tact could not remember the harm he had done us because of all the kindness he displayed in order to make us forget it. Still, for more than one reason, it was embarrassing to be dependent on him. He had entirely won our friendship. Though it is said to be pleasant to be under obligations to those whom you care for, that is not always true. It is enough to be able to admire those whom one owes gratitude. But in the case of true friendship, one is alarmed by anything that might tarnish the purity of that emotion. An obligation, when contracted, obliges one to feel grateful. Where real friendship is concerned, one wishes every feeling to be wholly spontaneous and dreads any sense of obligation. Every time the Emperor of Russia came to see me at Paris or at Malmaison, it was difficult to avoid bringing up the subject of our affairs. One day I told him about having advised my brother not to leave Italy. I added that although altogether unfamiliar with politics, I felt one should always avoid putting oneself in a position of asking a favor, but rather make the other party say, "Let me give way in order to have it over with." The emperor laughed at my methods, but doubtless he found that they were fair enough. So great was his desire to make himself useful to us that he even called one evening on Mademoiselle Cochelet to find out from her details regarding my tastes and habits and what I might particularly desire. This action revealed how much he wished to look after our interests and touched me greatly. But what was there I could ask him either for myself or my children? Fate had just deprived them of everything. I did not then know how difficult it would be to secure any recognition for them in the ways of title or rank. Monsieur de Nesselrode had already declared it was impossible to give them sovereign powers anywhere, that in view of the name they bore, none of the powers, and especially not England, would consent to abrogate the agreement amongst themselves, that no members of the Bonaparte family were to be allowed to rule. The only thing that remained to settle was the question of their income, and for that the Treaty of April 11th had made ample provision. The Duke of Vicence, Caulaincourt, recognized already how difficult it would be for him to see that the articles of this treaty were properly observed. He was pleased that in my case a separate agreement prevented the new sovereign from interfering with me. He therefore decided with the Emperor of Russia and Monsieur de Nesselrode that a duchy should be created for me out of the income of 400,000 francs, the sum fixed by the Treaty of April 11th, and coming from the forests that I owned near Saint-Leu, which a decree of the Emperor Napoleon had turned over to me several years before. Thus my children would have a fortune more firmly assured them than that which was mentioned in the Treaty of April 11th. This duchy, which the Allies asked should be given me, gave me a title better suited to my present rank, and at the same time did not deprive me of that which the treaty itself declared was non-revocable. I should be able to stay near my mother, near my friends, in my native land. How many reasons were there for accepting what was offered me? I gave my consent without asking my husband's approval, believing that he would be satisfied to have his children receive such a compensation after all they had lost. He could do nothing for them himself. Should he not rejoice that chance had placed me in a position to assure them a home in their own country and to provide against their wandering about, obliged perhaps to make their way in life far from the land where they were born? It was true. I did not yet know how fierce political passions could be. I could never have imagined anyone could hate little children of their age. Otherwise, I should have decided to leave in the midst of so many enemies those who were dearer to me than anything on earth. The estate of Saint-Leu belonged jointly to me and my husband. When the latter left Holland, the emperor had intended to make it over entirely to me. I refused, not wishing to take advantage of the king's absence to despoil him of his property. Nevertheless, as I did not own any other ground elsewhere, and as my husband had written me from Graz that Saint-Leu belonged to me, it was decided that it was there the duchy should be created. The Prince of Condé had taken over again the possession of the forest which I owned, but which formerly had belonged to him. But I still retained those of Ermenonville and L'Île d'Adam, which were to belong to the duchy. The rest of the 400,000 francs was to consist, as agreed, in government securities. While these various negotiations were going on, the Emperor of Russia naturally heard Saint-Leu frequently mentioned and wished to see what it was like. He fixed a date on which to get up a family party to spend the day there. The party consisted of himself, my mother, my brother, and me. The only other person was Marechal Ney, whom the emperor frequently called on, and of whom, like her husband, he was very fond. The emperor drove up in a little calash, accompanied by Monsieur Chernychev. During lunch, he remarked to me, "Do you know that there is a solemn service being celebrated in Paris today in honor of King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette? All the foreign monarchs are supposed to attend. And as we drove out here, I pointed to Chernychev, the curious position in which I find myself. I arrived at Paris filled with animosity against your family, and it is only in their company that I enjoy spending my time. I have inflicted injuries on you. I have benefited others, but it is only from you I secure sincere affection. Today I should be at Paris with the other kings, and here I am at St. Leu. We kept on chatting about the strangeness of human life, and after lunch we all took a walk in the forest. We passed certain spots where I had had improvements made and which I pointed out with considerable pride. None of this still belongs to you, remarked the emperor sadly. He seemed so sorry to think that it was he who was responsible for the grief I probably felt that I answered gaily, "At least I'm still able to enjoy it." We remained till quite late in the park. My mother retired to the chateau, and while my young ladies played different games in the shadows of the tall trees, I walked about alone with the emperor. He informed me how high an opinion of me he had conceived on account of my courage in enduring so many losses without seeming to be afflicted by them. I replied that I deserved less credit for not having been saddened by such a great loss than another person might have, since I had never really enjoyed my brilliant state and could not regret deeply a thing about which I had never particularly cared. I added that although I was indifferent about many things, there were others which touched me deeply. Thereupon, I proceeded to describe some of the saddest experiences I had gone through, the bitterness of which had destroyed my peace of mind. I was constantly expecting a new misfortune to befall me, and when it was not one which touched my heart, I felt greatly relieved. This condition had existed since the death of my son. My health had been profoundly affected, and the recent loss of Madame de Broc, that friend of my childhood, had renewed all my despair and my fear of the future. The emperor seemed to listen most attentively to even the slightest detail of my narrative, and to be as much moved by my eulogy of my friend as though he had known her. Frequently he would interrupt me with the remark, "But you still have friends. I have not met anyone anywhere who has not spoken well of you. You are unjust towards Providence, and you do not trust enough in the loving kindness of God." He in turn related some of the sorrows that had saddened his life. He assured me he had always found prayer a great consolation, and he placed his hopes in God. He told me this incident. When we were at the gates of Paris, all the generals believed we ought not to attempt to take the city. We hardly had ammunition enough left for one day, as the Emperor Napoleon had outflanked us and cut us off from all our supplies. If Paris had resisted 24 hours, we might have all been lost. Alone, holding out against all the others, I persisted in favor of an attack. In this moment of cruel perplexity, I withdrew to my own apartment. I realized the heavy responsibility which rested on my shoulders. I prayed God earnestly. Then, full of confidence, I no longer doubted we should be successful. Imagine what my feelings were on hearing this. I learned that the fate of France, the overthrow of the emperor, had only been a question of luck, and that the emperor and his country had been on the point of emerging from the struggle victorious and greater than ever. But the opportunity had passed, and we must resign ourselves. I sought to suppress my emotions and continued our conversation. I admitted to my companion that my misfortunes had disturbed my religious beliefs. To be sure, I could not doubt the goodness of God, but when still very young, I had formed the idea that he only sent misfortunes to those he desired to punish. I had received such cruel blows that I could not believe I had deserved them. From then on, my ideas became unorthodox. I enjoyed doing good because it made me happy. All people who were unfortunate aroused my sympathy because I knew what it was to suffer. But deprived of any purpose in life or any spiritual guidance, I looked only to the hereafter to give me any consolation, any escape from my troubles. The emperor disagreed with many of my ideas, which he considered pessimistic. He repeated to me several times, "Trust in God. He does not abandon those who love him." I have had cruel experiences in my own life, he added, but my conscience, which justified me in the sight of God, fortified me always. I brought him my troubles, and he comforted me. He could justly reproach me for a certain fault, which I feel I have not the power to resist. Yet I still place my trust in him. The emperor went on to give me some details about his domestic life, in the happiness he found in a love affair, illegitimate is true, but which in the 18 years it had lasted he had come to consider a sacred bond. He spoke of his children, described the woman he loved, and when his wife was mentioned, he said, "Although any reconciliation is impossible between us, she has no better friend than I in the world." The games the young ladies were playing had stopped. People were waiting for us. We went back to the house. In spite of the kindness the emperor did not cease to display towards us, my mother, who was constantly sad and depressed, could not overcome her anxiety regarding my brother's future. I promised her that I would overcome my embarrassment and speak to the Emperor Alexander about this. But after dinner, she herself had a talk with him, which seemed to relieve her mind. When he was on the point of retiring for the night, the emperor assured me that nowhere had he felt as much at home as in my house. Elsewhere, wherever he went, he encountered a formal atmosphere which he found oppressive. Instead of this, when he was with us, he felt as though he were at home. I explained that the flattering opinion he had formed was due to the informal atmosphere I had created in my drawing room, and the pains everyone took not to seem unduly conscious of his presence. The Emperor of Russia left at 9 o'clock in the evening, and my mother and I returned to Malmaison the following day. I heard that at the newly constituted court, this intimacy of ours with the Emperor of Russia was very much and very unfavorably criticized. Monsieur Sosthenes de la Rochefoucauld came and told me how much everyone had been shocked at the date I had chosen to hold a reception for Emperor Alexander. I replied that neither my means nor my position allowed me to give a reception. The date had been chosen a long time in advance, and the entire affair had been purely informal one, and not such as would shock anybody. He then confessed that my mother's intense popularity had given offense at court, and there had been rumors going about that she was having funds distributed among the working classes. I smiled at such stories and related the following incident. While we were at Blois, the emperor's treasure chest was in danger of being captured. It was therefore judged advisable to pay over to the persons present the sums due them, especially as the Treasury Department was behind in its payments. A sum of 600,000 francs was deposited with a local banker on behalf of my mother and myself. This represented only a part of what was due us. A few days later, the Duc d'Angoulême, while passing through the town, seized that deposit, which was our legitimate property, paid his soldiers with it, and we have never seen a penny of it since. The rest of the emperor's private funds were turned over to the provisional government. By way of conclusion to this story, I said to Monsieur de la Rochefoucauld, "You see how plausible it is that my mother, who is known not to have any money of her own, should distribute money to the discontented elements of the population." I do not know if what I said convinced him, but I noticed that all the signs of sympathy which the aristocratic class had previously been lavishing on us vanished, and instead we were regarded with distinct suspicion. Jealousy had a great deal to do with this attitude. The Emperor of Russia cut a great figure in the eyes of the old nobility. They thought themselves the only person worthy of his notice, while he was, on the contrary, instead of seeking their society, sought that of the very people whom he had come to overthrow. Consequently, all sorts of stories got about regarding meetings of conspirators at Malmaison, where they made threats against the royal family, and an unfavorable interpretation was placed on the Emperor of Russia's frequent visits. Even his own ministers became alarmed and spoke to him about the matter, but this did not prevent the visits from continuing on as before. One day, when my mother was not very well and could not go out, my brother and I took Emperor Alexander to see the famous waterworks at Marly. On the way there, we discussed the general subject of friendship, and we referred to that which united Eugène and me. The emperor also spoke feelingly about the union which existed in his own family, and then turning to my brother, he added, "I can hardly believe that I have only known your sister such a short time. She seems to be someone I am meeting again, and whom I knew in the past. I feel absolutely sure not to be misunderstood when I talk to her." I thanked him for this tribute and assured him it touched me deeply. Then the conversation changed, and we spoke of the recent campaign. He explained to my brother the reason which had caused the delay of the troops marching by way of Troyes for 24 hours. That delay, of which Emperor Napoleon took advantage to beat the two armies separately at Montmirail. The Austrians and English had resolved on their arrival at Troyes to declare their intention of refusing negotiations with Emperor Napoleon and to proclaim the return of the Bourbon dynasty. He, on the other hand, had been alone in his determination to push on first to Paris in order to discover there what the French really wanted and give them an opportunity of themselves choosing the monarch they desired. While this discussion was going on and the Russians were advancing along one route, the Austrians halted for 2 days. This lack of unity in their movements was fatal to the plans of the Allies, thanks to the skill with which Emperor Napoleon took advantage of their weakness.